Hi guys, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox, and boy, do I have a new deal for you today. Not one of those tired old deals you might have heard about before, but a brand new deal. And this one is brought to you by none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's right, this is FDR's plan to get America out of the Great Depression during the 1930s. Now, FDR is going to run against Herbert Hoover in the election of 1932, and let's be honest, Hoover could have run against a dog and he probably would have lost. You see, Hoover had been sitting in the Great Depression for nearly 3 years, and he didn't seem to have an answer for it. Now, we can't put all the blame on Hoover because he kind of inherited a lot of the economic woes that came about during the 1920s. But he didn't have an answer to what was happening. Now, Hoover was old school. He believed that the government needed to stay out of the American economy. And to be honest, he probably looked back at other economic panics and say, I don't know, 1893, 1873, 1837. You get the idea. We've had a lot of economic panics. And in all the previous ones, the government really didn't do much. And we seemed to come out of them just fine. So why was this one different? Now, there could be a number of reasons. It could be the global scale of this depression. It could be the number of people who were actually affected by this depression. A lot of times in the past, it was primarily just farmers, but this was the entire society. Or it could be the media coverage of it all. Let's face it, the more media you have, the more problems you see. I don't know, it could be all of the above. But the bottom line was Hoover did not have an answer. Enter FDR, who in 1932 is going to promise America a New Deal, which will elevate him into the presidency. So here we go. Let's take a look at FDR's New Deal, and you can determine, is this what got us out of the Great Depression? As I mentioned, in the election of 1932, Republican Herbert Hoover was running against Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Roosevelt's campaign was based on this idea of a New Deal. Well, what was this New Deal? To be honest with you, during the campaign, Roosevelt didn't know. The whole term New Deal is going to come from his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention when he was nominated to be the candidate. Within his speech, there was this line, I pledge you, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people. And that was it. The press zeroed in on those two words, New Deal, and that became the Democratic platform. So FDR kind of had to scramble and figure out, well, what is this New Deal? So he's going to get with his brain trust, his most trusted advisors, and they actually will come up with the New Deal. It's going to mark a change in American government policy from laissez faire to more involvement. It's going to determine that the government is responsible to make sure that our economy runs smoothly. And make no mistake about it, the New Deal is going to permanently increase the size as well as the power of our federal government. When you look at the structure of the New Deal, it had three key components, and we refer to these as the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, we need to get checks and jobs to the American people as soon as possible. Recovery, we need to create programs that will allow our economy to start growing again. And finally, reform, programs that will be put in place to prevent something like this from ever happening again. Now, we can look at FDR's New Deal program as two distinct programs, the first New Deal and the second New Deal, and I'll split those up for you, but really it all goes under the umbrella of the New Deal. In his inaugural address in 1933, FDR is first and foremost going to take the role as the calming influence, using the bully pulpit of the presidency to reassure Americans that they would be okay. He famously said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And this is going to be the mantra that he's going to carry forth into his presidency. Now, he's also going to step up and start talking to the American people more often. He's going to use what's called fireside chats. The idea behind the fireside chats was these would be weekly radio addresses that FDR would make to the American people, just to let them know what's going on. But more importantly, it was presented as FDR sitting next to his fire in his home, just talking to the American people as if they were sitting right there with him. That voice of calm, that voice of reassurance that they could count on. On top of that, to help control the American fears that were being felt from coast to coast, FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, will start traveling throughout the country, talking about her husband's program and how they will help the average American. Now, in today's society, anytime a new president is elected, the first 100 days seems to be examined under a microscope. This really started with FDR because people expected him to come into office and hit the ground running, do everything that Hoover had not done. The very first legislation that will be passed is the Emergency Bank Act of 1933. And what this did was it shut down all the banks. We created a 4-day bank holiday, which would allow time for federal advisors to go into banks throughout the country and determine their viability. And if they determined these banks to be economically fit, they allowed the doors to be reopened. And you as an American citizen, when you saw those doors open, you basically saw the U.S. government putting their stamp of approval on that bank, telling you it is safe to put your money back in the bank. Because so many banks failed, Americans lost their faith in the banking system. And as you know, throughout American history, banks have provided a critical role to our economy. The next act that will be passed, you are familiar with today. It's called the Glass-Steagall Act. And what this did was it set up the FDIC, the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation, a government agency that protects your deposits in the bank. The FDIC tells you that your money that you put in the bank is safe, even if that bank goes out of business. Now, originally, the FDIC insured deposits up to $5,000. Today, that value is much higher. I think it's near like $100,000 or more, if I'm not mistaken. But if you're not sure, every time you go into the bank, look for that little FDIC sign next to the teller window, and it'll tell you how much you can put in the bank and not worry about losing. The next steps that were taken, well, first is going to be the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corps. What this is going to do is start sending out relief checks to Americans. About 15% of the hardest hit Americans received a check from the federal government. They also created the Federal Emergency Relief Act that's going to send almost $500 million to states that they could use in their welfare programs to help their citizens. The Gold Reserve Act is going to be passed in January of 1934, basically removing America from the gold standard. We're not going to use gold anymore to value our dollar. In fact, the federal government made it illegal for people to own gold certificates or gold. So what they did was they required Americans to sell their gold and gold certificates back to the U.S. government. What this is going to do is it's going to allow the government to increase the money supply and at the same time lower interest rates. Now, the rest of FDR's programs are what we call the alphabet soup of programs, and you'll see why here in just a second. Let's start with the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. The CCC is what we call a shovel-ready entity. We're going to put Americans back to work, whether they're digging ditches, picking up trash, sweeping streets. Whatever job we can create, we're going to do that. Because FDR believed if people were working, that's naturally going to raise the morale and the spirit. And honestly, we really needed an attitude adjustment in America at this point. The CWA is the Civil Works Administration. This is money that's going to be put in the infrastructure of America. People are going to be given jobs building roads, building bridges, building waterways, whatever it was, but something to build up the infrastructure within our society. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, is going to focus on raising crop prices for farmers. How did they do that? Well, basically, they paid farmers to leave some of their fields empty. Remember, during the 1920s, farmers were losing a lot of money because of overproduction. We had to end that. We had to get rid of the surplus. So now the government's going to pay you not to farm on part of your land. That's going to limit the amount of produce that's going to come out of the farms, thereby raising the prices. And crop prices will start to go up. The TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, is going to create jobs in Middle America using hydroelectric power. It's going to allow us to get electricity to areas that didn't have it, and also bring in new farming techniques through irrigation ideas and stuff like that. The problem with the TVA, though, is you're going to see a number of dams being built to create this hydroelectric power. And so 15,000 people are going to be displaced, or otherwise they're going to have to learn to live underwater. Either way, we're also going to see a situation, especially with regards to power, that the federal government was going into direct competition with private business. So it's kind of on shaky ground. But the TVA, honestly, still exists today. The NIRA, the National Industry Recovery Agency, is put in place to try to regulate wages as well as prices. Now, the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, is going to fix wages for employees. It's going to fix prices as well. They're going to put quotas on business. This is how much you can and can't produce. And it's also going to give employees the right to join unions. You can't deny someone employment just because they're part of the union. We're also going to see the PWA be created, the Public Works Administration. This is kind of a continuation of the CWA, except grander scale projects. So we're going to see things like LaGuardia Airport being built under the PWA, or Hoover Dam. So I think you're seeing why this was called the alphabet soup recovery plan, because it's all these initials. That was really the focus of the first New Deal. The second New Deal is going to have a different focus. Quite honestly, by 1935, we're still in a depression. Yes, people are working more, but we are still in a depression. And so that's when we're going to start looking at economic reform. How can we really start to change things? This is when you're going to see the WPA, the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, and the Fair Labor Standard Act all be created. I'm going to talk about each one of these. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, you're going to see Congress appropriate $5 billion. And this money is earmarked specifically to employ people who still don't have a job. And we're going to see this done on large-scale public works projects. Airports are going to be built, like we saw with LaGuardia. 651,000 miles of roads are going to be built. Libraries are going to be created. Hospitals are going to be built. It's an extension of the CWA, but again, on a grander scale. Within that is the NYA, the National Youth Administration, an opportunity for young people between the ages of 16 and 25 to get jobs as well, along with education. Finally, the Social Security Act. This is probably the most well-known act that came out of the Great Depression. This was a fund to provide old age pensions for disabilities and unemployment to Americans. The way they funded it was through a payroll tax. If you have a job today, you might see this on your pay stub. FICA, F-I-C-A. This is your Social Security Administration tax. During the Roosevelt administration, the relationship with labor is very important. The Wagner Act is going to be passed. And what this did was you guaranteed you the right to join a labor union or create a labor union, as well as the power to negotiate or collectively bargain with management when it came to labor needs. A lot of people referred to this act as the Magna Carta of labor. The Fair Labor Standard Act is going to finally create child labor laws, age restrictions. It's going to create a minimum wage, and it's also going to set 40 hours as the typical work week. If you work over 40 hours, you are guaranteed time and a half today because of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, in the beginning, FDR promised us a New Deal, and he delivered. All of this new legislation came through, and that was his New Deal. The problem was we were still in a depression. We weren't out of it. Yes, we saw unemployment go down. At its height, it was at 25%. We saw it drop down to, I think, around 16 or 17%, but then it was starting to go up again because a lot of these jobs that were created were only temporary. They weren't long-term solutions. And then we also had to deal with the people after a while who said, this isn't working. And so you had opposition to the New Deal saying it's just not enough. It's not getting the job done. A couple of the most famous people who objected to this, Father Charles Coughlin, Francis Townsend, and Huey Long. Coughlin initially was totally behind FDR, but then it just got to be, you're not doing enough. We need more. And so he started his Roosevelt or Ruin campaign. He's going to create the National Union for Social Justice. Believe it or not, an old argument comes up. The production of free silver. Remember that from the 1890s? He also believed that the major industries of our country should be nationalized, put under government control. So stepping away from capitalism and moving towards socialism. Francis Townsend is going to push for an old age pension. Basically a stipend that would be paid to every American over 60 years old, $200 per month, but conditional. It had to be spent. You couldn't save it. So everyone over 60 would get a $200 check every month that they would have to spend. But probably the biggest opponent to the New Deal and FDR is going to be Huey Long. Huey Long is going to run for president, actually, and he's going to run on the Share Our Wealth platform. And the idea behind this is, number one, we need a very progressive tax code. So everyone who makes over $100 million has to pay 100% in taxes. I'm just doing the math in my head. If I make $100 million and I got to pay 100%, I have nothing. So now I'm unemployed. Also, he believed that every American family should get the equivalent of $5,000. And what was that equivalent? They should get a house, they should get a car, and they should get a radio. And he promised that to the American people. The value of that would be $5,000. On top of that, every American family would get an annual income guaranteed of $2,500. The amount of money this was going to cost is astronomical. On top of that, free college education for everybody and or vocational training, old age pensions, veterans benefits, and a month's vacation for every single person who worked. I'd go for that. Unfortunately for Huey Long, he is going to be assassinated, and upon his assassination, a song called Every Man a King is going to be composed in his honor. The election of 1936, the end of Roosevelt's first term. Bam! Look at that. He's running against Alfred Landon, who campaigned on the ability to manage the New Deal more efficiently. And FDR's response was, well, how can you manage something that I created? He's going to run into some problems, though. At the end of his first term, the Supreme Court is going to reverse several of his New Deal programs, determining that they were unconstitutional, specifically the NIRA and the AAA. As a result, FDR is going to try to get the passing of the Justice Reorganization Bill. The idea that he wanted to pack the court. And what that meant was we had 9 justices on the Supreme Court. He wanted to add 6 more. Pack the court with more. Now keep in mind, if he has 6 more justices, that means he can appoint who those justices will be. And in theory, they would support him more. Congress is going to step up and say, no. We see what you're trying to do. We see you're trying to merge the judicial and the executive branch together. We're not having that. They have to be separate. When we look at the legacy of the New Deal, these are programs that were created under FDR, primarily in that first term, that still exist today. The FDIC, the SEC, which oversees stock trade, the National Labor Relations Board, the Social Security Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and finally the Federal Housing Authority. So though the New Deal did not spring us free of the Great Depression, it did create programs that were long-lasting and, like I said, still in existence today. So what pulled us out of the Great Depression? I mean, by the time we get to 1940, like I say, our unemployment is rising up near 20% again. we really didn't see that much of an improvement over the 8 years that FDR's been in office. Well, if you know anything about history, you know what's right around the corner. World War II. And that's going to be our next topic. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and click that like button for me. Otherwise, we're going to see you on our next video where we're going to look at America's attempt to once again stay neutral while the rest of the world goes to war. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.